Nick here, and I don't think that spies and the spy genre as a whole get a lot of love in modern board and card gaming, which is why I was very happy to see Agent Hunter announced. It's designed by Mike Elliott and published by AEG, and is part of AEG's line of micro card games like Love Letter, which I did a review for and liked quite a bit. And in this game, it's two players only, and you're trying to conquer the other player's spy bases. You have your set of spy bases, and your opponent has his set, and you're just trying to take over his before he takes over yours. And you'll score points, and whoever has the most points wins. And you could probably play it over a series of rounds because it's very quick, and figure out who's the ultimate winner once you get to a certain amount of points. Does this game really capture what it feels like to be a spy, and is it worth your time? Let's take a look, and I'll let you know what I think. Agent Hunter is a simple card game of bluffing and deduction for two players. So each player starts off with a handy little cheat sheet if they need it to determine the turn sequence and the setup and how things are going to go. And both players have a small deck of 10 cards numbered from 0 to 9. There's really not much on the card, just some pretty fairly cool comic book style spy art and a number down in the corner, like I said, from 0 to 9. And they're all pretty much the same. These are the blue player's cards. The red player has his own deck of cards that has different art, but functions basically the same. Just show you a few of these. The goal of Agent Hunter is to conquer your opponent's bases and gain points for them. Your bases are 3 cards that you're going to take from your hand at the beginning of the game and put face down in front of you. You're going to do this without showing your opponent. During the course of the game, you have one action you can take on your turn, and you have 3 different options of what to do with that action. The first is to make an attack from your hand against an opponent's base. When you do that, you're going to take one of the other 7 numbered cards from your hand, point at one of your opponent's bases, and say, I'm attacking that base. So in this case, I'm attacking this base of my opponent's with the number 2. So my opponent is going to secretly look at this card. If this base happens to be the number 2 of my opponent, then I have successfully attacked and conquered that base. I will put my card like this. I have shown that I've conquered the base, and those 2 cards stay there like that until the end of the round. But if this card is higher or lower, which in this case it is, this is the number 8, so it's higher, my opponent will simply look at it, place it back face down, and say higher or lower, in this case higher. At which point I'll simply take my card back into hand, and now it's my opponent's turn. If you don't want to attack from your hand, you can instead attack from one of your bases. Let's say I've successfully deduced that this card is the 4. I've been counting the cards that my opponent has played and has in hand, and that I've deduced from the other cards in the table, and I know that that's got to be the 4. And I know that I've already got my 4 down on the table as one of my bases. I can make a direct attack from my base against my opponent by going like this and saying, I'm attacking. Now, let's look at this. My opponent looks at the card, and he reveals that I was right. This is the number 4. So, much like making an attack from my hand, I will claim that card as a conquered base. Then I'll immediately replace my missing base on the table with one of my cards. Now, it's very possible that that could have gone horribly wrong for me. So, let's redo this and say that that was not the number 4, but that it was the number 3. So, I make a direct attack. I'm attacking that base with my 4. My opponent looks at his card in secret and says that it is higher or lower. In this case, it is lower. And because I attacked directly with my base, my opponent is going to get to take the 4 from wherever it is, either if it was one of his bases or from his hand, in this case from his hand, and take my base instead. If it was one of the other bases in play, he would do the same thing, and he would get to replace his base as well. So that can be a very risky move. Now, there's one other thing you can do on your turn instead of the other 2 actions. Let's say that you know your opponent has narrowed down what number one of your bases is, and you think it's in serious danger of getting conquered by your opponent on his or her next turn. You can choose on your turn to instead take a base back into hand and replace it with another card from your hand, therefore making a new base. In fact, you can take a card off the table and put the exact same card back down in order to bluff your opponent. But every time you do this, you're going to take one of these 5 chips, and each player has 5 chips, blue and red. You take one of those chips and you're going to put it next to any one of the 3 bases, including, if you want, the base that you just replaced. If your opponent manages to conquer one of the bases that has one or more of these chips next to it, each chip next to that base is going to count as a bonus point at the end of the game for whoever's conquered it. And so let's say, for example, I've had to do this 2 times during the course of the game, and my opponent had to do it just once during the course of the game. The first time that someone conquers all 3 of their opponent's bases, the game is going to end. So let's say that red was able to do it to me and conquer all my bases. Of course, these cards would be face up to prove that. And I was able to conquer maybe one of my opponent's bases. So in this case, how the scoring would go is that red would get 3 points for having 3 conquered bases, but would also score 1 more point and then an additional point for a total of 5 points because of the chips, the decoy chips, next to each of my bases. I would still score points, but I would only score 1 point for a base conquered and no extra points because I was not able to conquer a base that had a decoy chip next to it. You can choose to end the game right there, or you can do this over a series of rounds, and after however many rounds you set, whoever has the most points at the end will be the winner. I like Agent Hunter quite a bit. It's a very neat, very fast, very simple to learn game about deduction and bluffing. Now, that's not to say that it is not complex at all. There's actually a little bit of brain burn here because it basically rewards players who are able to count cards and keep track of the constant flipping back and forth of cards. You can think you know exactly what card your opponent has in play, but then your opponent takes that card back into hand, and all of a sudden you're back to square one, and you're like, oh, okay, gotta do the math again. So it can be a little tense. You're trying to figure out what your opponent has based on what they've played, and at the same time, while you're trying to deduce what your opponent has, you have to keep track of what your opponent has deduced about your bases. And so you have to make those critical decisions. Okay, my opponent probably has a 50-50 shot of playing the right card on my base, so should I... But I know I'm pretty sure that my opponent has this card down for one of his bases, and I can take it out right now, but then he can take out one of mine. What should I do? So, and also the idea that you can directly attack an opponent's base with one of your bases is very cool and adds a cool dynamic to it. And the decoy chips are probably the most unnecessary part of the game, but it does add a little bit more tension because, okay, I can take one of my bases back, but now it's going to give more points to my opponent, potentially. So that's neat, but somewhat unnecessary. I like it. It's definitely not too deep, and it's how fast it is very, very nice. It's sometimes difficult to get some of the 2-player games I have to the table because for whatever reason, some of the 2-player games I have are very, very long. So, for instance, Earth Reborn is a very good example of that. I can't always get that to the table because it's just too long, but Agent Hunter is a great 2-player game that I can play with whoever shows up first to my game nights and just knock it out of the way, and it can be fun. I question how much longevity it has because it doesn't have any sort of real depth to it, potentially over time. But for what it is and for the price point that it's at, I like it. It also is very abstract. You could easily make the argument that this can be played with a basic set of playing cards, and it can. I think that the artwork is very, very cool. I like it a lot, but it's completely superfluous. There's no real theme to this game. And I never felt like I was conquering spy bases. But I appreciate that they put that artwork on there to sort of sell that idea. It did go the extra mile. It could have been much, much worse. So I like it. If you are turned on by the idea of brain-burning deduction, then this is definitely the game for you. It's definitely a game you can play between games like Letters from Whitechapel or any other kind of deduction game, just to get you maybe warmed up for those type of longer, more complex games. If you are kind of turned off by that idea, if you prefer something even lighter than this, then you have better options, maybe even from AEG's own line of lighter card games. But I like it. It's pretty cool. That's Agent Hunter from AEG, designed by Mike Elliott. Thanks for watching, and get out there and game every day and in every way.